The Germans were not fully prepared for the scale of effort they had to exert to defeat the Red Army. They noticed that this campaign was unlike any other. The enemy was entirely different. It turned out that the Red Army possessed a vast projection of power. The saturation with military technology was immense. Despite the Germans having better tactics, the sheer mass of the opposing army made an impression. Contrary to popular belief, the Red Army put up strong resistance from the first day of the war. If the Germans thought that one simple strike would cause the collapse of the Stalinist system of totalitarian repression, they were greatly mistaken. Numerous books and movies portray Operation Barbarossa, the initial 3-month invasion spanning from June 22nd to late September 1941, as a seamless succession of triumphs for the Wehrmacht. There's a prevalent narrative in literature suggesting that the Red Army's resistance was feeble, marked by chaotic retreats, panicked abandonments of weapons, and instances of soldiers defecting with arms to join the opposing forces. But is this depiction accurate? It's somewhat vague. On June 22nd, 1941, the Wehrmacht launched Operation Barbarossa, inflicting gigantic losses on the Red Army. It achieved many spectacular operational successes, penetrating hundreds of kilometers into the heart of the USSR. Contrary to appearances, it achieved this while also suffering gigantic losses. The Red Army suffered defeats and lost countless soldiers, but fought very tenaciously, despite pockets. Its resistance eventually wore down Hitler's army. The Red Army suffered extensive losses in tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Millions of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, yet the German advance continued. While the Soviet army was poorly led and fought less effectively than the Germans, it still put up a fierce resistance. Despite its shortcomings, it fought on. The Red Army fought fiercely but crudely. Though there were isolated incidents of soldiers defecting with weapons, they were minor compared to the size of the Red Army. Soviet soldiers may have lacked finesse, proved to be formidable adversaries, holding their ground as long as they were commanded. Conversely, the German army achieved victories, but paid a steep price for them. In 1941, two gigantic armies clashed. When reading reports and memoirs from the first days of the fighting, many German soldiers emphasized the fanatical resistance of the enemy. There were cases of surrender, but there were also cases of desperate fighting to the last soldier, or more often, to the last bullet. We shouldn't draw too hasty conclusions that Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 1941 was a simple operation for the Wehrmacht. It was exactly the opposite. Germany prepared 3.3 million soldiers for the attack on the Soviet Union. The Red Army had around 2.5 million soldiers in the operational zones. Never before, in the Polish campaign or the French campaign, were such gigantic forces assembled for battle. Within the first month of the war, the German army defeated part of the enemy army on the Bialystok-Belarus axis. Just within a month, the Army Group Center under Marshal von Bock, attacking from the Warsaw region through Belarus, reached the gates of Smolensk. They covered half the distance to Moscow in just 30 days. Along the way, von Bock's forces encircled two pockets, where ultimately, after heavy fighting, over 600,000 Red Army soldiers surrendered. Hundreds of thousands of others killed, wounded, or went missing. At the same time, the Army Group North under Marshal von Lieb also penetrated deep, advancing through the Baltic states, and within the first month covered half the distance to Leningrad. The most difficult task was undertaken by the Army Group South under Marshal von Rundstedt, which fought against the largest concentration of the Red Army. However, by the end of June 1941, it defeated the Red Army forces in the eastern territories of Poland, gradually forcing the Red Army to retreat eastward towards Kiev. The USSR suffered colossal losses, but the victory of the Wehrmacht was also paid for with enormous losses. Never before had any army inflicted such losses on the Wehrmacht. The Germans were not fully prepared for the scale of effort they had to exert to defeat the Red Army. They noticed that this campaign was unlike any other. The enemy was entirely different. In the eyes of the Germans, Red Army soldiers did not have the full status of prisoners of war. In terms of technology, no previous opponent of the Wehrmacht had as many tanks, aircraft, artillery pieces, mortars, or machine guns. It turned out that the Red Army possessed possessed a vast projection of power. The Germans destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft, yet they still had to repel further attacks in the following days because the Russians had plenty of aircraft and airfields. It couldn't all be defeated or destroyed in a short time. The saturation with military technology was immense. The Wehrmacht attacked someone who had more weapons than the Wehrmacht did. This was felt on the battlefield. Despite the Germans having better tactics, the sheer mass of the opposing army made an impression. Contrary to popular belief, the Red Army put up strong resistance from the first day of the war. If the Germans thought that one simple strike would cause the collapse of the Stalinist system of totalitarian repression, they were greatly mistaken. Indoctrination, surveillance, and fear of communism were stronger for hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers than the fear of the Germans. The Red Army often fought ineffectively, stereotypically, schematically, and poorly, but fiercely, bloodily, and brutally. Germans reported that when companies of their battalions advanced too far and were cut off, when they surrendered after running out of ammunition, they were eliminated. Red Army soldiers also did not take prisoners. It was a cruel war on both sides. The Germans were cruel. The Red Army troops were also cruel. The Red Army had 12,000 tanks and 2.5 million soldiers in the operational zone. This meant that the Germans had to face this colossus from the first day of the war in the east. They began to suffer unimaginable material losses, for which no one was prepared. The chief of the general staff of the Wehrmacht land forces assumed that the German army could lose up to 300,000 soldiers. However, even these calculations by German staff officers quickly turned out to be significantly underestimated. In June 1941, the Germans lost 40,000 soldiers in battle in the east in 9 days, killed, wounded, and missing. In July, as they conducted massive offensive operations across the entire eastern front from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathians, they suffered losses of over 50,000 soldiers. In August, these losses reached almost 200,000 people. In September, the German army, while achieving a series of spectacular victories under Bialystok, Smolensk, and Kiev, driving the Red Army beyond the Dnieper, reaching Smolensk, approaching Leningrad, paid a price of 550,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Large losses for a period when the German army was victorious. These were losses that the Wehrmacht was unable to replenish. They were losing their military potential. Continuing the count and summing up, the Germans suffered the following losses. In October, 664,000 eliminated. In November, 750,000. In December, 830,000. Every third German soldier who crossed the border on June 22nd was no longer alive by the end of the year. They were either wounded, in captivity, or missing. Statistically, because we must remember rotations, the Germans introduced 20 new divisions from reserves. The Red Army suffered significantly higher losses. In 1941 alone, over 3 million soldiers became prisoners of war. The largest number of prisoners was taken in the encirclement near Kiev, and the largest pocket at Bryansk-Vyazma. In total, in these two encirclements, the Germans took over 200,000 prisoners. However, all these victories achieved in 1941 were reminiscent of the victories of the Prussian era. The Germans exhausted themselves advancing eastward. The German logistic system was not prepared for such large losses. Moreover, they were unable to replace lost aircraft, tanks, soldiers, and trucks with new ones. Even if the logistic system worked fully, there were no reserves that could replenish losses so quickly. By August, the German army had 87,000 killed, 300,000 wounded, and 20,000 missing, totaling over 400,000 losses. At the same time, the reinforcements reaching the army in the east amounted to 217,000 people, half as many as they lost. The further they went east, the weaker they became. Space and time played in favor of the Red Army. In September, the Germans irretrievably lost 30% of their tanks. Another 23% were undergoing repairs, leaving only 47% ready for combat. There were issues with repairing tanks as they went into repairs because the German industry couldn't simultaneously produce enough spare parts for the tanks already manufactured and new tanks. Hitler prohibited limiting the production of new tanks in favor of spare parts for the existing ones. Consequently, as the Germans advanced eastward, they had fewer tanks, while tanks remained in the right. These tanks weren't directed to the front as per Hitler's decision. The replenishments in tanks were absolutely inadequate compared to the loss losses suffered. In June 1941, the Wehrmacht attacked with around 4,000 armored combat vehicles, of which approximately 3,500 were tanks. By November 30th, 1941, according to German reports, irretrievable losses amounted to 2,400 tanks. Additionally, there were hundreds of vehicles undergoing repairs, which couldn't be quickly restored due to the lack of spare parts. By December 1941, the German armored forces on the Eastern Front were only a shadow of themselves. This can be seen in the reports of the 2nd Panzer Army under General Guderian. The 3rd, 4th, 17th, and 18th Panzer Divisions had 980 tanks in their armored units. They suffered 632 losses but received only 167 replacements. In November, this group had 415 tanks, half of what they started with in Operation Barbarossa, but only 210 were combat ready. By December, only 105 tanks were combat ready in these same 4 Panzer Divisions. The combat potential of the 2nd Panzer Army diminished tenfold over 6 months of fighting. This situation prevailed in almost all German panzer groups. They were completely exhausted within 6 months. The Wehrmacht suffered massive losses in officers. The shortages were 3 times greater than the replacements. The quality of an army is always linked to the quality of its officer and non-commissioned officer corps. Losses in the officer corps couldn't be made up as quickly as losses among regular soldiers. In the general staff of the German land forces, there was a tense atmosphere due to the progress of Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa simultaneously went well and went poorly. The Germans clearly emphasized that the resistance of the Red Army was beyond expectations. Encirclement and pockets were destroyed for too long, leading to the involvement of many infantry divisions and the detachment of armored groups from infantry divisions, which had to stay behind to destroy the pockets. This negatively affected operational capabilities. In 1941, over 6 months, the Wehrmacht lost more soldiers than they would later lose throughout the entire year of 1942. In 1942, over 12 months, the Germans lost approximately 1 million soldiers on the Eastern Front. In 1941, they also lost 1 million soldiers, but in just 6 months. The battles in 1941, victorious as they were in the offensive, were twice as bloody for the Germans as their time on the front in 1942. In 1942 and 1943, the Germans did not suffer losses like they did in 1941. In 1941, the cream of their army perished. The best soldiers, the most motivated, trained even before the war, heavily indoctrinated officers, and non-commissioned officers. The losses from the first half year of the war, the strong resistance of the Red Army, forced the Wehrmacht in the following years to conduct operations of limited scope, no longer on the entire front as they did in 1941. In 1939, when Germany sparked the war, they had 100 divisions. When they invaded the USSR in 1941, they already had 200 divisions. Later, the Wehrmacht would expand to even 300 divisions. However, in terms of material, nothing could match the exhaustion and depletion of resources in 1941. Germany understood in the summer of 1941 that such a campaign on 3 fronts could only be sustained for a few months, and they were no longer capable of such operations. In 3 months, July, August, and September, Germany consumed 1 million tons of gasoline on the Eastern Front, their entire annual production. They were unable to generate similar consumption for a longer period in 1942 and 1943. When the battle for Moscow was underway, German losses were 3 times smaller than in August 1941 because it was a fight between 2 weakened armies. In November 1941, General Guderian had 100 tanks instead of 1,000. The Russians faced a similar situation. Very small forces were fighting compared to the summer of 1941. In November, December, and January 1942, alongside combat losses, there were very high statistics of frostbite, so Wehrmacht losses were still significant, but combat losses were incomparably smaller than in the summer. In August 1941, Germany came to understand the impossibility of their task. Sustaining such losses was unfeasible, and these losses stemmed from the rapid pace of their advance. It became evident that there were insufficient reserves of gasoline, no backup tanks, and only half of the personnel replacements were filling the gaps. The incapacity to replenish forces emerged as a critical aspect of the German failure. Despite Russians suffering losses at a ratio of 7:1, they still inflicted losses on the German army that couldn't be replenished in the short term. Barbarossa was meant to be a brief campaign lasting a few months, and the Germans knew from the outset that failure to defeat the Red Army within this time frame would result in defeat. By the end of July, reports arrived with statistics indicating that half of the tanks weren't operational. The army had lost 200,000 soldiers, the Luftwaffe had lost over 1,000 aircraft, and had consumed 300% of the fuel quota allocated for 1941. By the close of July 1941, the Germans acknowledged that achieving the operational plans of Barbarossa was unattainable due to space, time, and the strength of the enemy's resistance. Generals began seeking solutions. Disputes arose over whether the primary goal should be Moscow or Kiev, driven by desperation. Since defeating the enemy in a war of attrition was unachievable as they continued to replenish, the decision was made to strike at the heart, to seize Moscow and attempt to overthrow the system. A rift emerged between Hitler and his generals and marshals, Moscow or Kiev. Ultimately, Hitler chose Kiev, believing that the war might not conclude in 1941, necessitating a consideration of the conflict in economic terms. This decision not only concluded the Battle of Kiev in September 1941, but also led to Fall Blau in 1942, which subsequently culminated in the Battle of Stalingrad. Hitler realized that he couldn't sustain such a prolonged campaign with the Wehrmacht on such a scale, having led it for 3 months and nearly depleted it. While generals aimed for a decisive battle, Hitler was alarmed by the level of losses. Hitler began redirecting the war from one of destruction, targeting Moscow, to one of attrition, an economic war. However, the Third Reich couldn't emerge victorious in an economic war against the USSR, leading German generals to realize by 1941 that it was the end. The war would continue for many years, but the conclusion seemed inevitable. The Red Army put up such fierce resistance in the summer of 1941 that it bled the Wehrmacht dry. The Germans emerged victorious, but at a great cost.